phrase which it seems to be rather everywhere, and I don't actually know where it's come from, but it's bandied around a lot, and I want to talk about it because I have some views on it. So the phrase is rooted in Christianity. As I said, I see it anywhere. You type in Quakers rooted in Christianity, lots of other things apart from actual Quaker websites come up. So it's obviously a thing, and I know it's a thing. And if you go onto like the introducing Quakers section on the Quakers in Britain website, it's there as well. Quakers are rooted. Quaker, although I think it says, although our belief is rooted in Christianity, it goes on to then say that obviously today in Britain at least, there are many Quakers who don't identify as Christian. And whilst I haven't got to the root of who coined that phrase, I think it's very interesting as to what it says about Quakerism. And it's actually, the more I've thought about it, different to what I initially took from it. So I suppose the first thing that I think this phrase does is that it does highlight maybe the tension, or is maybe a good compromise phrase to describe Quaker faith to an outsider, but also compromising also on the inside as well. I think it's a phrase which seems to appease both Christ-centered Quakers and also non-theist Quakers. The Christian Quaker can look at it and think, well, yes, that's our heritage. Excellent, is in there, so it's fine that I'm a Christian Quaker because that's that's where we've come from. So good. Whereas the non-theist or maybe even atheist Quaker would turn around and say, "Ha, yes, good. We are beyond this now. We understand that that's where we came from. We're not trying to say that that's not the case, but thank goodness we've moved on from that Christian stuff now." And I suppose those are the two extreme views of that, maybe, and there's probably a whole spectrum of people who can identify with that phrase and can say that that is a true representation of what Quaker faith is like. I think it is also really helpful for outsiders because it can be really tricky to explain what Quakerism is, and especially its relationship with Christianity. And I think that's quite a useful way of talking about it because it allows for that scope of saying, yes, it came from Christianity, and yes, it is still very Christian in many of its elements, but in many ways, it's no longer Christian to some people. Now, obviously, again, wanting to focus, this is from Quakers in Britain perspective, so this is a liberal view of Quakerism. I'm not saying this is a general Quaker thing. This is a British liberal Quaker thing. Personally, when I first saw this phrase, I didn't like it. I thought I felt the compromise in there, and it didn't sit well with me. I think also because I think if I am going to be on that spectrum, I'm probably going to be more Christ-centered than maybe non-theist, and so I see the rooted in Christianity kind of as a way out, and saying, oh, well, we're rooted in Christianity, instead of like fully committing to the Christian story, the Christian narrative, and the Christian elements in Quakerism. However, recently I've been thinking, actually, for Christian Quakers, that the rooted in Christianity is perhaps going actually a bit beyond a compromise phrase in favor of the Christian heritage and the Christian flavor of Quakerism. I was thinking, obviously, what does a great oak tree need in order to be a great big successful tree? Well, it needs deep and strong roots. And so if we're looking at Quakerism as the tree in this analogy, then having Christianity as its roots, then we're saying that is strong, that is important and foundational to Quaker faith. And it got me thinking a bit about when I was talking with Ben Wood last year about this Jesus narrative, and that sort of from which flows a lot of what Quakers believe and what Quakers do even today, and reclaiming that heritage. Actually, even if you're not a Christian, but being part of that and seeing the roots of that and be able to explain that to outsiders. Because obviously, as we've talked about in those videos, if we remove our roots and our heritage, therefore, we lose who we are and we become quite inexplicable and it fall into the trap of perhaps being quite shallow in terms of what we're trying to do and what our belief is. Now, as I said, I'm not trying to say that we should all be more Christian. That's not my message. But what I think we have to acknowledge that and actually take strength from those roots, from even if you are a non-theist or however you take Christianity and Quakerism, if you have to acknowledge it, because otherwise you're getting rid of a lot of history, as well as the Quaker story, and a lot of the narratives that we take as Quakers only really make sense when understanding that these Quakers that we're talking about were Christian. More conversely, I suppose why a non-theist might not like the line "rooted in Christianity" is for the opposite reason. This and you do hear, I have heard it said that, well, you know, the fact that the early Quakers were Christian was merely because of their cultural upbringing, or that was their cultural milieu. So they couldn't have been anything else. So what was more important to them, though, was the experience that they were feeling, that the presence of the divine, and that was what was most important to them. That's what they felt. That's what convinced them. And the fact that they were 17th century Englishmen meant, of course, they understood that in the Christian framework. They couldn't have done it any other way. And, they would extrapolate this further and say, if this sort of awakening had happened in India or in the Americas pre-Columbus, then they would have taken a very different narrative around their experiences. And Quakerism, as it would then would look very different. And actually, if you look at many different sects and branches of other faiths, you do get very similar-ish things to what Quakers are saying. And so this rooted in Christianity is just a happenstance of where Quakerism began. Well, I have issues with this line of thought for quite a few reasons. I think, firstly, it kind of goes down the universalist pluralist view of Quakerism that it's the experience, it's that it's all that matters, that you don't need. It doesn't have to be in the Christian framework. We can all feel that. You can come in from any different angle and experience it. It doesn't matter if you're Christian or Buddhist or Hindu, or everyone can experience the inner light. And that's obviously absolutely true. And early Quakers were very, very much in favor, more so than other denominations, were very, very accepting of the universality of the inner light, and accepting, quite controversially at the time, that Jews, that Muslims, that the main people who they knew that weren't Christian could experience the inner light. They didn't need to know the story of Jesus in order to experience that, in order to be saved. However, I think to negate the Christianity of the early Quakers is fundamentally flawed. I think that's very much a 21st century view, and we're putting that view onto them. It's us looking at people in the 17th century and saying, yes, they were Christian, but they couldn't help it. I'm sure if they didn't, if they had an option, they might not have been. They might have, if they knew more about what other mystics or whatever we're talking about, they'd be more like that, and they would get rid of the Christian stuff. And the fact is, I don't think they would. I think they were fundamentally Christians. They were. I mean, if you read Berkeley, or if you read any of the early Friends, they were very, very, very convinced that they were Christian, and to the extent that William Penn talked about being that Quakerism was Christianity, primitive Christianity revived. If it wasn't that important to them, they would have. I mean, I just think that is. I think that's quite a patronizing view, to be honest, of how to deal with people in the past. So going back to rooted in Christianity, I think that was a bit of quite a lot of a tangent. I think we have to accept that if we mean rooted in as in originally came from, then that has to be true, and that can't be refuted, really. In terms of, if we look at the term rooted in Christianity sort of figuratively or metaphorically, then I think what it means is that is where we need to take our spiritual strength from, in a way. Then I think we need to recognize that is our heritage and that is our story, and we should take strength from that, regardless of whether or not that's actually what we believe. Like that, I mean, there's a lot in the traditional Christian narrative which I'm uncomfortable with. I don't particularly enjoy, and still working through and trying to understand myself. And I'm not going to say, well, everyone needs to believe the same as me, because I'm not even sure what I believe on half the things. But that is where we as a society, and that's where the history of our society, that's where it makes sense. That's where it's rooted. And to deny it would be to say, like, oh, the roots aren't there. We need it in order to explain our Quaker story. We need it to explain our Quaker testimonies that are inherently coming from that Christian source as well. Again, what we do with it now doesn't necessarily need to be. But I think for the non-theist, I think there does have to be that acceptance that this is where Quakerism came from, and see that for the good that it can be, rather than seeing that as a negative thing. And I suppose for the theist and for the Christ-centered friends, I think that can be a source of real strength, in the same way that if you are a Christian Quaker, then the Christian element is certainly going to be something which nourishes you and sustains you and upholds you. But at the same time, the caveat there, I think, for those friends would be that we have to be open to new light as well, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to have fit within what would be considered the traditional Christian framework. That we have to be open to what if we believe in continuous revelation, that the inner light is still talking, that the story hasn't come to an end yet, then yeah, it's going to develop in its own way, and maybe that might not be how the Christian story might understand it, but that we still take our strength from it, I think helps to build that story along with others who have differing beliefs. And I think that's part of a lot of what Quakerism is, in terms of listening to each other and finding, if not a consensus, the sense of the society, if you know what I mean, from that Quaker term of the sense of the meeting. So from a phrase that used to really annoy me, I think I've gained new insights as to why it's used, maybe what it can mean in ways that I hadn't initially contemplated. I'm wondering if I'm the only one who's ever considered that phrase particularly, and if not, and if I am, even now that you've watched this lovely video about it, what do you think? Do you think I'm balmy? Do you think I'm reading too much into a phrase? What does it mean to you that Quakerism is rooted in Christianity? Be interested to know. So thank you for watching. Hope it's been interesting, and I'll see you for the next one. See you again soon. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.